My name is Natalie, 33 years old, and sitting in a Manhattan family court. I listened to my husband's attorney tell a judge I was an irresponsible wife with no job, no assets, and no defense. My husband Richard and his family sat in the gallery smirking as they prepared to strip away my custody. They thought I was just a naive woman doing data entry from my couch. They had no idea that for 5 years, every keystroke I made built a federal treason case against them. When a woman in a tactical suit walked up the aisle and dropped a folio-stamped Central Intelligence Agency on the bench that superiority shattered. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever stood up to a family who underestimated your worth. You will want to hear how this disaster unfolded. Richard's attorney projected his voice so it echoed off the walls. He pointed a sharply manicured finger at me. Your Honor, my client is the CEO of Kensington Tech, a company valued at $50 million. And what is she? She is an unemployed house spouse. She claims to do part-time data entry. She has no real income, no personal assets, and no capacity to provide for my client's son. We ask for full physical custody and an immediate freeze on all joint accounts. I sat at the respondent's table, my hands folded in my lap. I did not cry. I did not protest. I just stared straight ahead. Behind me, I could hear the venomous snicker of my mother-in-law, Patricia. She sat next to her golden child, my sister-in-law, Caroline. "Did you see her shoes?" Caroline whispered loudly. "She bought them at a mall outlet. It is embarrassing that Richard ever let her carry his last name. She is completely helpless without him." Richard sat 2 feet away at the petitioner's table. He leaned back in his leather chair, a victorious smile on his lips. He genuinely believed he had won this pathetic game. He believed that after 5 years of treating me like an incompetent maid, he could simply discard me and take my child. Mrs. Kensington, the judge sighed, looking over his spectacles. "You have not retained legal counsel. If you cannot provide a defense against these claims of financial dependency, I will have no choice but to rule in favor of the petitioner. Do you have anything to say?" Before I could open my mouth, the heavy oak doors burst open. The loud thud made Patricia gasp. Richard turned around, visibly annoyed. A woman in a sharp navy blue tactical suit strode down the center aisle. 2 men in dark suits took positions at the doors, locking them from the inside. "Excuse me," the judge barked, slamming his gavel. "This is a closed family court hearing. Security, remove these people immediately." The woman ignored him completely. She bypassed the security bailiff, who had frozen upon seeing the federal badge on her belt. She walked straight up to the bench and slammed a black leather folio onto the wood. The folder bore the gold seal of the United States government and a bright red stamp reading, "Top Secret, Eyes Only." "Central Intelligence Agency." The woman said, her voice ice cold. "This courtroom is now under federal jurisdiction. I need you to clear the gallery, immediately." The judge's face flushed red with anger. "You have no jurisdiction here." "Read the first page." "Your Honor," the agent interrupted, tapping the folder. With a trembling hand, the judge opened the folio. His eyes scanned the first paragraph. I watched the color rapidly drain from his face. His jaw went slack. He looked from the paper down to Richard, and then slowly locked eyes with me. The annoyance in his gaze was entirely replaced by absolute terror. Bailiff, the judge, croaked, his voice suddenly dry. "Clear the gallery, everyone out. Now, what is the meaning of this?" Richard stood up his chair, scraping violently. "Your Honor, you were about to grant my motion. Mr. Kensington, sit down and shut your mouth," the judge snapped, wiping sweat from his forehead. He slammed his gavel down. "The petition for asset freezing is denied." Patricia stood up in the gallery, clutching her pearls. What is she doing? Did she hire actors? Arrest her. I slowly turned around in my chair. I looked at Patricia, then at my older sister-in-law Caroline, and finally at my husband Richard. The meek, obedient housewife they had bullied for 5 years was gone. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of an apex predator that had finally trapped its prey. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a bomb dropping. The judge's gavel had echoed like a gunshot, and now no one dared to breathe. Richard stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from his handsome face. He looked at the female agent standing rigidly by the bench, then back to me, his eyes wide with a frantic mix of confusion and rising panic. "What is going on here?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking just a fraction. He turned to his high-priced attorney, grabbing the man's expensive suit sleeve. "Do something. File an injunction. Tell the judge he cannot just dismiss my case because some woman walked in here with a fake badge." The attorney physically pulled his arm away from Richard's grasp. He was staring at the red top-secret stamp on the leather folio, as if it were coated in poison. He swallowed hard, hastily shoving his legal pads into his leather briefcase. "Mr. Kensington," he whispered urgently, his professional bravado entirely gone. "I am a family law attorney. I handle divorces, alimony, and custody disputes. I do not mess with the federal government. You are on your own. You cannot be serious." Richard hissed, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "You work for me. I pay you $1,000 an hour. Not anymore." The attorney muttered, snapping his briefcase shut and taking a large step away from the petitioner's table. He did not even look back as he practically bolted for the side exit reserved for court staff. The judge stood up, his robes swishing loudly in the quiet room. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Patricia or Caroline, who were still standing frozen in the gallery like statues. He only looked at the federal agent. "The transfer paperwork will be finalized within the hour," the judge said, his voice completely stripped of its former authority. "I want no part of this. Good day." With that, the judge fled through his private chamber's door, leaving the courtroom in the hands of the intelligence agency. The two men in dark suits remained stationed at the main doors, their hands resting comfortably near their holstered weapons. Richard finally turned his full attention back to me. The veins in his neck were bulging against his silk tie. He stepped toward my table, pointing an aggressive finger at my face. "Natalie, what kind of sick joke is this? What did you do? Are you trying to extort me? Because I swear to you, I will ruin you. I will make sure you never see our son again." I did not flinch. For 5 years, raising his voice was all it took to make me apologize. For 5 years, I had perfected the art of making myself small, of staring at my shoes, while he and his family berated my background, my clothes, and my supposed lack of ambition. I had played the role of the useless dependent wife with flawless precision. I had swallowed every insult, every condescending remark at family dinners, and every instance of blatant disrespect. Now the performance was over. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a loud screech against the marble. I picked up the cheap faux leather purse I bought from a discount store. I calmly snapped it shut. I looked directly into Richard's eyes, holding his gaze with a cold, unblinking intensity that made him falter. He took a tiny, involuntary step back. "Say something!" Richard yelled, his voice echoing in the empty chamber. "You crazy, pathetic woman, answer me!" I did not say a single word. I did not need to. My silence was a weapon, and I was wielding it with absolute precision. Let him drown in his confusion. Let him feel the sudden terrifying shift in power. He had spent years telling me I was nothing, a parasite draining his wealth. Now he was looking at the woman who had spent every night beside him, quietly dismantling his entire illegal empire, keystroke by keystroke. Every time he slept after a long day of feeling superior, I was awake, securing his digital footprint. Patricia pushed her way through the small, swinging gate that separated the gallery from the tables. Her face was contorted with pure, aristocratic rage, her expensive pearls shaking against her collarbone. "Richard, do not engage with her. She has clearly suffered a psychotic break. I am calling the chief of police right now. We will have her arrested for fraud and disrupting a legal proceeding." The female agent turned around from the bench. "Ma'am, if you take your phone out of your purse, I will consider it a threat to federal security and have you detained." Patricia gasped, clutching her designer handbag to her chest as if she had been physically struck. I turned away from my husband and his mother. I walked calmly down the center aisle, my cheap shoes clicking steadily. The two agents at the doors stepped aside, opening the heavy wood to let me through. "Where are you going?" Richard screamed after me, his voice pitching higher in pure desperation. "You cannot just leave. We are not done here." Oh, we were done. His perfectly curated life of luxury built on the treasonous sale of classified military tech was about to crumble into dust, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the demolition. I stepped out of the courtroom and into the brightly lit hallway, leaving them trapped in the nightmare I had meticulously built. The heavy courtroom doors clicked shut behind me, muting Richard's frantic shouting. The polished marble hallway of the downtown federal building was incredibly long and brightly lit under the harsh fluorescent lights. For a brief second, I let myself breathe. The air felt cleaner out here, away from their suffocating presence. But my moment of peace was instantly shattered. The doors flew open again and hit the wall with a loud bang. Patricia and Caroline marched out, their heels striking the floor like hammers. They were not going to let me walk away that easily. "Natalie, stop right there," Patricia ordered, her voice echoing down the empty corridor. I kept walking toward the elevators. I had no reason to listen to a woman who had spent 5 years treating me like an unpaid intern in my own marriage. Caroline sprinted ahead and physically blocked my path. She crossed her arms, her designer handbag dangling from her wrist. "You really think you can pull this off?" Caroline sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Do you think we are stupid? You probably hired those people from some cheap talent agency. Central Intelligence Agency. Please. You cannot even figure out how to properly fold Richard's dress shirts. There is no way a woman who buys her clothes at discount racks is a federal agent. You are just a pathetic gold digger trying to extort my brother for a payout." I stopped and looked at Caroline. Her arrogance was almost comical. She had spent her entire life riding on her family's wealth, completely blind to how that wealth was actually generated. "You are going to jail for this stunt, Natalie." Patricia caught up to us, breathing heavily, her face red with exertion. "Impersonating a federal officer is a serious felony. I am calling our lawyers right now. We are going to bury you so deep in legal fees you will never see daylight again. You will be on the streets where you belong." I just stared at them. I did not defend myself. I did not argue. Arguing with them was like arguing with a brick wall. I simply stepped to the side to walk around Caroline and continue my path. That was when a large figure stepped out from the alcove near the elevators, completely blocking my escape route. It was DeAndre, Caroline's husband. He was an African-American man, with a towering athletic presence, impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit. DeAndre was not just family by marriage. He was the chief financial officer of Kensington Tech. He was the man who moved Richard's dirty money around the globe. He was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely complicit in the treason they were committing. He looked down at me with a cold, calculating expression. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document and a silver fountain pen. "You are not going anywhere, Natalie," DeAndre said, his voice deep and menacing. He took a step closer, using his physical size to intimidate me. He had always been the quiet enforcer of the Kensington family, the one who handled the messy business behind the scenes while Richard kept his hands completely clean. He shoved the paper toward my chest. "This is a voluntary surrender of parental rights," DeAndre explained smoothly, as if we were merely discussing a routine corporate merger. "You are going to sign it right now." I looked at the thick legal document, then back up at him. I did not reach for the pen. "Listen to me very carefully." DeAndre continued, leaning in close so I could smell his expensive cologne. "You played a cute little trick in there, but it ends now. I have already contacted the bank. I personally froze every single credit card with your name on it. I changed the security codes to the main estate. You have $0 in your checking account. You do not even have enough money to call an Uber to take you back to your cheap little hometown. You are completely cut off from the world." Caroline smiled triumphantly, stepping up beside her tall husband. "You heard him. Sign the paper, Natalie. Give us the boy." And maybe DeAndre will give you a $20 bill so you can take the bus to a homeless shelter. DeAndre tapped the silver pen against the document. If you do not sign this, I will make sure you leave this city with absolutely nothing. No child, no money, no future. We own the judges in this town. We own the police. You are a nobody trying to fight a massive empire. Sign the paper, Natalie. Do not make me force your hand right here in this hallway. They stood there, a unified front of wealth and corporate corruption, waiting for me to break. They expected the tears to start falling. They expected the trembling hands and the desperate apologies. That was the script we had followed for 5 years. They broke me down, and I surrendered. But the weak woman they knew did not exist anymore. I looked at the pen, then at DeAndre's smug face. I felt a slow, dark smile spread across my lips. I did not take the pen. Instead, I prepared to deliver the first real blow. I looked at the silver pen in his massive hand. It was a custom Mont Blanc. Richard had given it to him for Christmas last year, right after they closed their first illegal deal. I slowly raised my eyes to meet his. "You froze my checking account," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the silence of the hallway. "That is very thorough of you, DeAndre. But you see, I do not need a single cent from that account anymore." He frowned, gripping the paper tighter. "Stop playing games, Natalie. Sign the document." I stepped closer to him. He was a foot taller than me, built like a linebacker, but right now I was the most dangerous person in the room. I leaned in, keeping my voice low so only the 4 of us could hear. "Did you really think freezing my cards would save you?" I asked smoothly. "Tell me, DeAndre, did you also manage to erase the digital footprint of the $4.2 million you routed through the shell company in the Cayman Islands?" The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. DeAndre stopped breathing. The smug, threatening posture melted off his body in a fraction of a second. I did not stop. I recited the data with the mechanical precision of a trained intelligence officer. The transfer was initiated at exactly 2:14 in the morning Eastern Standard Time. You used the encrypted server Richard installed in the basement, routing the funds through 3 different European banks before dropping it into the offshore account, ending in 4829. The account registered under a fake corporate entity that I have already seized. DeAndre took a physical step back. His hand shook the silver pen, trembling between his fingers. The color drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. "What are you talking about?" Caroline snapped, stepping forward completely oblivious to the gravity of what I had just said. She looked at her husband, confused by his sudden panic. "DeAndre, what is she saying? Make her sign the paper." DeAndre could not speak. He just stared at me, his eyes wide with a terror that I had never seen in him before. He was the brilliant CFO. He knew his encryption was supposed to be military grade. He knew no ordinary house spouse could possibly know those numbers, let alone the exact timestamp of a transaction he made in the dead of night. "You are bluffing," Patricia hissed, though her voice lacked its usual venom. She was starting to realize that the ground beneath them was collapsing. "You are just throwing out random numbers." I turned my gaze to Patricia. My eyes were cold. "Am I, Patricia? Because the federal agents currently securing your son's servers do not think I am bluffing. The grand jury that issued the subpoenas this morning does not think I am bluffing. And when the IRS audits your personal trust fund by the end of the week, I promise you they will not think I am bluffing either." I looked back at DeAndre. He was sweating now. Tiny beads of moisture formed on his forehead. The legal document in his hand hung uselessly at his side. "Keep the pen," I told him quietly. "You are going to need it to sign your plea deal." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response. I did not need one. I walked away, my footsteps echoing rhythmically down the long corridor. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the federal building and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The chaotic noise of downtown Manhattan washed over me, a beautiful contrast to the sterile, oppressive atmosphere of the courthouse. A sleek, black Chevrolet Suburban with dark-tinted windows and government plates was idling at the curb. As I approached, the back door swung open. A junior agent nodded to me from the front seat. I climbed into the back, the heavy door closing with a solid, secure thud behind me. I sank into the leather seat, pulling out my secure mobile device. The screen lit up with dozens of notifications. Operations were moving forward. Search warrants were being executed. The trap had been completely sprung. Through the tinted glass, I watched the courthouse doors open. DeAndre, Caroline, and Patricia stumbled out onto the sidewalk. They looked disoriented, like survivors of a shipwreck washing up on a hostile shore. Caroline was yelling at DeAndre, pulling his arm, demanding answers he was too terrified to give. Patricia was frantically dialing her phone, desperately trying to reach a lawyer who would not answer. "Drive," I said to the agent behind the wheel. The SUV pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the city traffic. I did not look back again. They had spent 5 years treating me like an ignorant, helpless victim. Now they were about to learn exactly what happens when you invite a wolf into your perfectly manicured suburban life. The first domino had fallen, and the rest of their empire was about to crash down around them. I stepped out of the mobile command center into the cool night air. For the first time in 5 years, I was not wearing sensible flat shoes or a bargain bin sweater. I wore a perfectly tailored navy blue designer suit that cut a sharp, commanding silhouette. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, practical knot. I felt an incredible surge of adrenaline mixed with a profound sense of liberation. The obedient, invisible wife was dead. The intelligence officer had finally come home. Flanked by a dozen agents in full tactical gear, I walked straight up the long, winding driveway of the Kensington estate. The private valet attendants froze. One of them dropped a set of Ferrari keys onto the pavement. The private security guards Richard had hired for the evening instinctively reached for their earpieces, but my lead agent flashed a federal warrant. The guards immediately backed away, raising their hands in submission. Nobody wanted to interfere with a federal raid. We reached the massive oak double doors of the mansion. I did not knock. I pushed them open with enough force that they slammed violently against the interior walls. The lively chatter of the ballroom instantly died. The string quartet in the corner faltered, hitting a few discordant notes before stopping completely. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the entrance. They expected to see another billionaire investor or a local politician. Instead, they saw me surrounded by heavily armed federal agents. I scanned the room. The absolute shock on the faces of the elite guests was intoxicating. They recognized me, but they could not reconcile the woman standing in the doorway with the meek housewife they had spent years ignoring. Before anyone else could react, Caroline broke out of the crowd. She stomped toward me, her face flushed with a mix of alcohol and pure indignation. Her heavy diamond necklace sparkled under the chandeliers. She completely ignored the agent standing beside me, her arrogance blinding her to the very real danger she was in. "What do you think you are doing, Natalie?" Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing in the silent ballroom. "How did you get past the gate? You have some serious nerve showing your face here tonight." I kept my hands comfortably in my pockets, staring at her with mild amusement. "Caroline, you might want to lower your voice." "I will do no such thing," Caroline yelled, taking another step forward to physically block my path into the main hall. "This is a private charity gala for respectable people. You do not belong here. You have never belonged here." She turned her head and snapped her fingers at one of the private security guards standing near the bar. "Hey, get over here right now and remove this trash from my brother's house. Throw her out on the street where she belongs." The security guard did not move. He was staring terrified at the federal agents who had just fanned out across the room, securing every exit. Caroline turned back to me, her eyes furious. "I do not know what kind of cheap costumes you rented for these people, but you are not ruining this night. Richard is done with you. My family is done with you. Leave right now before I have you physically dragged out by your hair." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply looked at the lead tactical agent standing to my right and gave a single brief nod. Secure the perimeter. The agent barked, his voice booming with absolute authority. Nobody leaves this room. Nobody touches their cell phones. This property is now under federal control. The agents moved with terrifying speed. They blocked the front doors, the patio exits, and the kitchen corridors. Panic rippled through the wealthy crowd. Several women gasped, clutching their husbands. A few men in expensive tuxedos tried to inch toward the back doors, only to find themselves face to face with federal badges and tactical rifles. Caroline finally seemed to realize that this was not a prank. The blood drained from her face. She looked at the heavy weapons, then at the serious faces of the agents, and finally back at me. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, just enough to make her shrink back. "This is not your brother's house anymore, Caroline," I said quietly, ensuring only she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "This is a federal crime scene, and if you do not step out of my way right now, I will have you handcuffed to that ugly ice sculpture for obstructing a federal officer." Caroline swallowed hard, her eyes wide with sudden suffocating fear. She stumbled backward, tripping slightly over the hem of her expensive gown, and pressed herself into the crowd. I walked past her, my eyes fixed on the grand staircase where Richard was still standing. He was frozen on the bottom step, his glass of champagne hovering near his chest. His young mistress was clutching his arm, looking around in utter confusion. The arrogant king of Kensington Tech was finally looking down the barrel of reality, and I was holding the gun. Richard stared at me as if I had spoken in a dead language. His polished shoes seemed glued to the marble steps. Two agents moved in behind him, their presence a silent command to start walking. He swallowed hard and slowly turned to lead the way. We moved away from the chaotic ballroom down the long corridor and approached the heavy steel door leading to the basement. This was a climate-controlled vault, retrofitted with reinforced concrete and a biometric security system. Richard paused in front of the retinal scanner, his hands shaking so badly he had to press them against his thighs. "You cannot do this, Natalie," Richard whispered, looking back at me with pleading eyes. "We can work this out. Whatever they are paying you, I can double it. Just call them off. Tell them you made a mistake." I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for 5 years. He was trying to bribe a federal intelligence officer with the blood money she was there to seize. It was almost sad how limited his worldview was. "Open the door, Richard," I said evenly. He shook his head, crossing his arms in a desperate show of defiance. "No, I know my rights. You need a specific warrant, and I am not opening it until my corporate lawyers get here." I let out a soft sigh, reached into my jacket pocket, and pulled out my secure mobile device. I did not need his retinal scan. I had spent countless nights listening to him brag on the phone, piecing together his protocols. I stepped up to the keypad beneath the scanner and punched in a 12-digit alphanumeric code. The heavy steel bolts clanked loudly, the hydraulic hinges hissed, and the massive door swung inward, revealing the dark humming cavern of his illegal data center. "How did you know that code?" Richard gasped, his face completely pale. "Only DeAndre and I have that sequence." I stepped past him into the freezing air. The blue and green lights of dozens of server racks blinked rapidly. "Because, Richard, you are incredibly arrogant. You assumed your home was impenetrable. You forgot that the greatest threat is usually the person you invite inside." The tactical agents filed into the room, connecting decryption devices to the main terminals. "Stop." Richard lunged forward, his panic overriding his self-preservation. He reached out to grab an agent pulling a hard drive. "You are destroying my life's work." Before his hand made contact, the lead agent pivoted, grabbing Richard by the wrist and twisting his arm behind his back in one fluid motion. Richard let out a sharp cry as he was slammed face first against the cold metal rack. "Do not move," the agent ordered, pressing his forearm against Richard's neck. I walked over to where Richard was pinned. "Your life's work is a direct violation of the Arms Export Control Act." "Why?" stated my voice, completely devoid of pity. "You have been illegally selling encrypted drone software to sanctioned military organizations. We have the wire transfers, the encrypted emails, and now we have the source code. You are looking at multiple counts of federal treason and corporate espionage. He squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear escaped, cutting through the sweat on his face. It was a tear of profound self-pity, because he had finally been caught. Pull every single drive, I ordered the technical team. Leave absolutely nothing behind. As the agents dismantled the racks, the sound of metal clicking filled the room. It was the sound of an empire collapsing. Richard slumped against the rack, the fight drained out of him. The untouchable CEO realized his money and arrogant family could not save him. Upstairs, I could hear the muffled sounds of the remaining guests being processed. Patricia and Caroline were up there watching their high society status evaporate. They had spent years mocking my background. Tonight they were learning that true power does not wear a diamond necklace. Take him upstairs and process him with the others, I told the lead agent. Let his mother and sister watch him get photographed in his own foyer. The agents hauled Richard to his feet. He did not look at me as they marched him out. I stood alone in the center of the server room, watching my team pack the drives into secure cases. The physical evidence was secured, but the domino effect was far from over. The financial mastermind was still out there. DeAndre knew the walls were closing in, and I knew exactly how a cornered man behaves when the ship starts to sink. As I walked up the basement stairs and back into the main foyer, the true devastation of the night was fully visible. The grand ballroom, which just an hour ago had been filled with Connecticut's wealthiest elite, was completely abandoned. The moment I had publicly exposed Richard's $200,000 bribe to the local police chief, the guests had fled like rats off a sinking ship. They left behind half-empty champagne glasses and overturned chairs in their frantic rush to escape the federal raid. The untouchable Kensington family had been thoroughly humiliated, their pristine social reputation destroyed in a matter of minutes. Patricia was sitting on a velvet bench near the front doors, her face buried in her hands. She was weeping loudly, her makeup running down her cheeks. She was not crying out of sorrow for her son's criminal acts. She was mourning the absolute loss of her old money social status. Caroline stood next to her, staring blankly at the federal agents who were methodically boxing up expensive art and financial documents from Richard's home office. The biting arrogance that usually defined my sister-in-law was completely gone. She looked small and terrified, replaced by the hollow stare of a woman who had just realized her country club membership could not stop a federal indictment. They had both spent the evening insulting my poverty, only to watch their own wealth be seized as evidence. I watched as two agents escorted Richard out of the house in handcuffs. He looked exhausted and broken. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled, and the confident smirk he had worn for the past 5 years was permanently erased. As he was pushed into the back of a black government vehicle, he did not even look at his mother or sister. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the manicured lawn, signaling the end of his reign. But while Richard was the face of the operation, I knew the financial architect was still loose. DeAndre had managed to slip away during the initial chaos of the raid. The next morning, the fallout was swift and catastrophic. I sat in the secure conference room at the Federal Building in Manhattan, drinking black coffee and watching the financial news networks. The breaking news banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen was devastating. Kensington Tech CEO arrested in federal treason and bribery probe. Within the first 15 minutes of the market opening, the company's stock plummeted by 45%. The same wealthy investors who had raised their crystal glasses to toast Richard the night before were now frantically calling their brokers to dump every single share. The corporate empire was bleeding out rapidly. Richard had managed to post an exorbitant cash bail to remain under house arrest at the estate, but his freedom was an illusion. He was trapped, and he was desperately looking for a way to shift the blame. Through the audio surveillance devices we had left hidden in the mansion, I listened to Richard plotting his defense. He was pacing his luxurious study like a caged animal, screaming at the few corporate attorneys who had not abandoned him. He needed a massive distraction. He needed a scapegoat to take the absolute fall for the illegal offshore accounts and the sale of military technology. He could not deny that the money had been moved, so he had to convince the government that he was completely ignorant of the transactions. He was going to throw DeAndre under the bus. In Richard's narcissistic mind, his brother-in-law was disposable. DeAndre was far too brilliant not to see the trap rapidly closing around him. He was the chief financial officer. His digital signature was on the transfers. He knew perfectly well that Richard and Patricia would happily serve him up to federal prosecutors to save their own skin. The subtle racist undertones of the Kensington family, which DeAndre had quietly tolerated for years in exchange for power and wealth, were about to be weaponized against him in a court of law. They would gladly paint him as the rogue African-American executive who orchestrated the treason entirely behind the naive CEO's back. DeAndre was looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary, while the family that never truly accepted him walked free. I stared at my secure mobile device waiting. I knew the exact psychological pressure DeAndre was under. He had a choice to make. He could wait for Richard's lawyers to frame him, or he could strike a deal. My phone buzzed on the metal table. It was an encrypted text message from an unregistered number. The message was brief. I have the decrypted master ledger. I need immunity. Meet me at the subterranean parking garage on 5th Avenue in 1 hour. Come alone. I smiled, locking the screen. The inside betrayal had officially begun. The Kensingtons were a family built entirely on greed, and now that the money was gone, they were going to tear each other to pieces. I grabbed my tactical jacket and headed for the door. DeAndre was about to hand me the final nail in Richard's coffin, and I was not going to be late for the delivery. The 5th Avenue subterranean parking garage was damp and echoed with the distant hum of city traffic above. I arrived 10 minutes early, driving an unmarked federal vehicle. I parked in the heavy shadows of level -3, leaving the headlights completely off. I did not have to wait long. The screech of expensive tires announced DeAndre's arrival. He drove a black Mercedes, pulling into the spot directly across from me. He turned off the engine and sat there for a long moment, clearly gathering his nerves. I stepped out of my vehicle, the sound of my boots sharp against the concrete floor. DeAndre got out of his car. He looked nothing like the arrogant, impeccably dressed executive who had tried to intimidate me in the courthouse hallway just days ago. He wore a wrinkled gray hoodie, his eyes darting around the empty garage in pure paranoia. He clutched a small silver flash drive in his right hand. "You came alone," DeAndre said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast concrete space. "I told you I would," I replied, stopping exactly 3 feet away from him. "I am a woman of my word, DeAndre, which is significantly more than I can say for your brother-in-law." He scoffed bitterly, running a trembling hand over his face. "Richard is losing his mind. He has his corporate lawyers drafting documents right now to claim I acted entirely alone. He is going to say I exploited a massive loophole in the corporate structure and hid the military tech sales from him. He is trying to serve me up to the federal prosecutors on a silver platter so he can walk away clean." "And you are surprised?" I asked coldly. "You married into a family that views everyone outside their immediate bloodline as entirely expendable. Did you really think they would hesitate for 1 second to sacrifice you to save their own skin and their precious reputation?" DeAndre shook his head, looking down at the oil-stained concrete. "I thought I was smarter than him. I thought I could control the offshore money and keep myself insulated from the actual treason. But Richard was always just using me. He needed a brilliant financial architect, but more importantly, he needed a scapegoat to take the fall if the federal government ever caught on." I held out my right hand. "Give me the drive, DeAndre. We do not have time for a therapy session." He hesitated, gripping the small device tighter. "Do you have the paperwork? The immunity deal we discussed?" I reached into my tactical jacket and pulled out a folded legal document bearing the seal of the Department of Justice. "It is an agreement for full federal immunity regarding the offshore financial accounts, contingent on your complete cooperation and your sworn testimony against Richard Kensington. You sign this, you give me the master ledger, and you walk away from the criminal charges. You will permanently lose your financial licenses and you will never work in corporate finance again, but you will not spend the next 20 years locked in a federal penitentiary." DeAndre swallowed hard. He reached out and took the document, scanning the dense legal terms under the dim, flickering fluorescent lights. He knew it was the absolute best deal he was ever going to get. He pulled a pen from his pocket, signed his name hastily at the bottom of the page, and handed the paper back to me. Then, with a shaking hand, he placed the silver flash drive into my palm. "It is all there," DeAndre whispered, his voice thick with defeat. "The routing numbers, the shell companies, the buyer profiles from the sanctioned nations. Everything Richard thought he permanently deleted from the basement servers." I slipped the drive and the signed document into my secure pocket. "You made the right choice today, DeAndre." Suddenly, the violent screech of another vehicle tearing down the concrete ramp shattered the quiet of the garage. A bright red Porsche slammed on its brakes, skidding to a halt just inches from the bumper of DeAndre's Mercedes. The driver's side door flew open, and Caroline stepped out. She looked completely unhinged. Her expensive blonde hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes were red from crying and pure rage. "I knew it," Caroline screamed, pointing a shaking finger at her husband. "I tracked the GPS on your phone, you absolute traitor." DeAndre stepped back, raising his hands defensively. "Caroline, you need to get back in the car and leave. You do not understand what is happening here right now." "I understand perfectly," Caroline shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the concrete walls. She marched toward him, completely ignoring my presence. "You are selling out my brother. You are selling out our entire family to this pathetic woman. After everything we did for you, we took you in, we gave you a career, we made you incredibly rich, and this is how you repay us, you ungrateful parasite." DeAndre's expression hardened instantly. The lingering fear he had shown me vanished, replaced by a deep, simmering anger that had clearly been building for years. "You did not do anything for me, Caroline. Your brother used my intelligence to launder his treason money. And now your perfect family is trying to send me to prison for his crimes. I am saving my own life." Caroline lunged at him, swinging her fists wildly in a hysterical rage. "I will ruin you!" she screamed, tears streaming down her flushed face. "You are destroying our lives!" I stepped back into the shadows, watching the wealthy, perfect suburban couple tear each other apart. The Kensington Empire was cannibalizing itself. The flash drive in my pocket felt heavy with justice. The final piece of the puzzle was secure, and it was time to watch Richard play his last desperate card. I stepped back into the shadows, watching the wealthy, perfect suburban couple tear each other apart. The Kensington Empire was cannibalizing itself. The flash drive in my pocket felt heavy with justice. The final piece of the puzzle was secure, and it was time to watch Richard play his last desperate card. DeAndre did not stay to argue with his hysterical wife. He knew that every second he spent in that garage was a second his immunity deal could be compromised. He pushed past Caroline, ignoring her scratching nails against his jacket, and got back into his Mercedes. He locked the door, started the engine, and reversed aggressively out of the parking spot. Caroline screamed, hitting the hood of his car with her bare hands, but he simply steered around her and sped up the concrete ramp, leaving her entirely alone in the cold, echoing space. I did not linger to comfort my sister-in-law. I walked back to my unmarked vehicle, got in, and drove away. As I merged into the city traffic, I plugged the flash drive into my encrypted terminal. The data immediately began uploading to the central servers at Langley. DeAndre had delivered exactly what he promised. The ledger contained every routing number, every hidden shell company, and every illegal buyer profile. The financial noose was officially tied. Back at the Kensington estate, the atmosphere was completely toxic. Richard was confined to the house under his strict bail conditions, pacing the floors of his ruined mansion like a trapped rat. Caroline arrived an hour later, her designer clothes rumpled and her makeup smeared down her cheeks. She burst through the front doors, hysterically sobbing, and threw herself onto the living room sofa. Patricia rushed in from the kitchen, demanding to know what had happened. He gave it to her. Caroline shrieked, burying her face in the cushions. DeAndre gave Natalie the master ledger. "He sold us out, he signed an immunity deal and drove away." Richard stopped pacing, the color completely drained from his face. He stared at his sister, his breath catching in his throat. "You let him give her the ledger," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of fear and rage. "Do you have any idea what you just did? That drive proves I authorized every single transaction." Patricia grabbed Caroline by the shoulders, shaking her violently. "Why did you not stop him? You stupid girl, you were supposed to keep him in line." "I tried," Caroline cried, pushing her mother away. "He does not care about us anymore. He said Richard used him." Patricia stumbled backward, pressing her hand against her chest. "If the federal government has that ledger, they are going to trace the seed money," she gasped, her eyes widening in absolute horror. "They are going to trace the initial investments back to my personal trust accounts." Patricia scrambled for her gold-plated smartphone. She dialed her private wealth manager in Geneva, her fingers shaking so badly she dropped the phone twice. When the call finally connected, she did not even bother with a greeting. "Transfer everything," Patricia ordered frantically. "Move the entire trust to the secondary accounts in Dubai. Right now. Do not ask questions, just do it." The voice on the other end of the line was quiet, hesitant, and utterly devastating. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. Your accounts were frozen 30 minutes ago by a joint order from the Department of Justice and the Treasury. We cannot move a single cent." Patricia dropped the phone. It shattered against the hardwood floor. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch of the Kensington family let out a hollow, agonizing wail. She collapsed onto the floor, realizing that her generations of old money were permanently gone. She was completely broke. Richard did not comfort his mother. He did not comfort his sister. His mind was racing, fully consumed by his own survival. If Natalie had the ledger, a federal indictment for treason was hours away. He would not just be facing a financial penalty, he was looking at life in a maximum security federal prison. He ran upstairs to his safe, grabbing a velvet bag filled with untraceable diamonds Patricia had hidden for emergencies. He stuffed them into a duffel bag along with a fake passport he had purchased years ago just in case his foreign deals ever turned sour. He believed his intellect made him superior to everyone else. Even now, stripped of his company, his money, and his allies, he genuinely thought he could outsmart the United States government. Richard slipped down the back staircase, entirely ignoring his mother sobbing on the floor. He bypassed the main security sensors he himself had designed, using a backdoor code the federal agents had not yet discovered. He crept through the dense woods at the edge of the estate, reaching the service road where a gardener's old truck was parked. He shattered the window, hot-wired the engine with frantic speed, and tore off down the road. His destination was not the airport. Not yet. He was heading straight for the elite private elementary school downtown. He was going to violate the temporary custody order, kidnap our son, and disappear forever. He thought this would be his ultimate revenge against me. As Richard sped the stolen truck down the winding Connecticut roads, he turned on the old radio. The financial news stations were broadcasting the absolute collapse of his entire existence. Kensington tech stock had officially hit rock bottom, halting trading entirely after a catastrophic 90% drop. Anchors were analyzing his arrest, calling it the greatest corporate scandal of the decade. Listening to his life's work being reduced to a cautionary tale on public radio pushed him further into madness. Just a few hours prior, before Caroline had burst into the estate with the news of DeAndre's betrayal, Richard had completely destroyed his luxurious home office. He had taken a heavy brass lamp and smashed his custom glass desk into thousands of pieces. He had ripped his framed tech awards off the walls, shattering the glass in a frantic rage. In that destroyed room, he had spent the morning desperately trying to execute his backup plan. He had been on secure conference calls with his remaining defense attorneys, meticulously outlining a legal strategy to pin the entire offshore network on DeAndre. He was going to present forged internal emails showing the CFO acted as a rogue agent. He fully intended to send his sister's husband to federal prison for life just to maintain his CEO image. But that plan was completely dead now. With the decrypted master ledger in my possession, the federal prosecutors had undeniable proof of Richard's direct authorization for every single illegal weapons tech sale. He could not use DeAndre as a scapegoat anymore. He was out of options, out of money, and out of time. The desperate reality fueled his erratic driving. He believed that if he got his hands on our son, he would hold the ultimate leverage. In his narcissistic logic, he thought a mother's love would force me to drop the charges and let him escape. He thought I was still the weak, submissive woman he could easily manipulate with emotional terrorism. Richard arrived at the elite private elementary school just as the afternoon recess was beginning. The campus was secured with iron gates and checkpoints designed to protect the children of billionaires. But Richard was still a recognized parent. He bypassed the main visitor gate, flashing his familiar face to the young security guard, who had not yet seen the breaking news of his federal indictment. Meanwhile, I was standing in the Tactical Command Center at the federal building in Manhattan, reviewing the uploaded files from DeAndre's flash drive. The evidence was pristine. We had everything we needed to lock Richard away for decades. I was just about to authorize the final arrest warrant for his transfer to a maximum security facility, when the red emergency phone on the main console began to ring violently. The lead tactical agent picked it up, his face hardening as he listened. He hung up the receiver and turned to me, the air in the room suddenly turning ice cold. "Your husband's electronic ankle monitor just went dark," the agent said sharply. "He breached the perimeter of his estate, and local police just received a panic alarm from your son's elementary school." Richard bypassed the security desk, physically shoved a teacher out of the way, and took the boy from the playground. The room fell entirely silent. The federal agents looked at me, waiting for the frantic reaction of a terrified mother. They expected me to break down, to scream, to lose my professional composure. I did not shed a single tear. I did not panic. The emotional manipulation Richard relied on was completely useless against my intelligence training. "Lock down the city." I ordered, my voice dangerously calm and authoritative. "I want a 5-mile perimeter established around that school immediately. Ground all private flights out of Teterboro, JFK, and every private airstrip in the tri-state area. Flag his passport and put a trace on every vehicle registered to the Kensington estate. Do it right now. He is driving a stolen commercial vehicle," the agent updated, looking at a fresh report. "A gardener's truck from the estate is missing." "Then track his burner phone," I replied instantly. "He thinks he is a ghost, but he is too arrogant to leave his encrypted communication device behind. He will need it to contact his foreign buyers for an extraction flight." I grabbed my tactical jacket and my sidearm. Richard had just crossed the final unforgivable line. He had escalated this from a financial treason case to a federal kidnapping. I walked out of the command center, the full weight of the United States government moving behind me. I was going to get my son back, and I was going to bury my husband in a concrete cell for the rest of his truly miserable life. I walked out of the command center, the full weight of the United States government moving behind me. I was going to get my son back, and I was going to bury my husband in a concrete cell for the rest of his truly miserable life. As I marched toward the secure elevator bank that led to the tactical vehicle bay, my encrypted device vibrated violently in my hand. I stopped, raising the screen to my eyes. The message was from DeAndre. It read, "I am in the subterranean parking garage beneath your federal building. Level 4. I know where Richard is taking your boy. I have the decrypted master ledger for his extraction logistics. I need absolute immunity. Come alone right now." I turned to my lead tactical agent. "Prep the strike teams and get the helicopters spinning on the roof," I ordered sharply. "I have to make a quick stop in the basement. I will transmit the target coordinates to your screens in exactly 3 minutes." I swiped my clearance badge and took the private elevator down into the dark, echoing depths of the federal building. The doors slid open on level 4. The air was damp and smelled of exhaust and cold concrete. I drew my sidearm, keeping it lowered but ready at my side. I trusted the intelligence, but I did not trust the man. DeAndre stepped out from the heavy shadows behind a massive concrete pillar. He looked entirely broken. The impeccably tailored suits and the arrogant swagger were completely gone. He was wearing a plain dark jacket, sweating profusely, despite the chill in the underground air. He held a small black external hard drive in his shaking hands. He called me DeAndre, said his voice echoing off the concrete walls. His tone was a volatile mixture of pure panic and deep festering rage. He called me from a burner phone 10 minutes ago while he was driving. He was completely frantic, demanding that I instantly wire $2 million in untraceable cryptocurrency to a ghost account in the Bahamas so he could pay his pilot. "And what did you tell him?" I asked, stepping closer but keeping a calculated distance. "I told him the truth." DeAndre spat bitterly. "I told him every single account was frozen. I told him the federal government had completely dismantled the network." And then he lost his mind. DeAndre shook his head, his eyes burning with a sudden fierce resentment. He screamed at me. He blamed me for the entire collapse. He called me every racist, degrading name you can possibly imagine. In his absolute panic, the polished corporate mask completely fell off. He told me I was nothing but a street-level thug that his family had generously elevated. He said I owed his family my life and that I was supposed to take the fall for him. After everything I built, after all the brilliant financial architecture I designed to make him a billionaire, he just saw me as a disposable black man meant to serve his narcissistic white family. "They are a family of parasites," I replied coldly. "I spent 5 years living inside that house, DeAndre. I know exactly how Patricia and Carolyn talk about people who do not share their bloodline or their bank accounts. You were always just a convenient shield to them, a scapegoat waiting to be sacrificed." "I know that now," DeAndre whispered, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Caroline is upstairs right now, probably drafting divorce papers to protect her own trust fund. They set me up to take the fall for the offshore accounts. But Richard made a fatal mistake. He thought I was stupid enough to leave the extraction logistics on his home servers." DeAndre held up the black hard drive. "This is the decrypted master ledger for his physical escape plan. It has the exact coordinates of the private unregistered airstrip his foreign buyers use for smuggling. He is not going to any of the major commercial or private airports. You will never find him or your son in time unless you have this drive." "Give it to me," I demanded, holstering my weapon and holding out my hand. "Not until I get it in writing," DeAndre countered, his desperation peaking. "I want a federal immunity deal. I want it signed by you right now. I will testify to everything. I will hand over every password. But I will not spend the rest of my life in a federal penitentiary for a racist, narcissistic sociopath who kidnaps his own child." I reached into my tactical vest and pulled out the specialized immunity agreement I had authorized earlier, anticipating this exact fracture in their syndicate. I clicked a pen and handed it to him. "Sign the bottom line. You will lose your career, your assets, and your licenses, but you will keep your freedom." DeAndre did not hesitate. He braced the paper against the concrete pillar and signed his name with frantic speed. He handed the document back to me, followed immediately by the black hard drive. I plugged the drive directly into my secure mobile terminal. The decryption software instantly recognized the files. A map populated on my screen, dropping a bright red locator pin on a remote, abandoned logging airstrip 50 miles north of the city. "You have your deal, DeAndre," I said, turning my back on him and walking swiftly toward the elevator. "The extraction team will be in touch." I pressed the transmit button on my radio, sending the precise coordinates to the tactical teams waiting above. The secret meeting was over. The financial architect had officially destroyed the CEO. Now it was time for me to hunt down my husband and take my son back. I had barely taken 5 steps toward the elevator banks when the deafening screech of heavy tires echoed through the subterranean level. A bright white luxury SUV tore down the concrete ramp, taking the corners so fast it nearly scraped the structural pillar. It slammed on the brakes, skidding to a diagonal halt that completely blocked my path. The driver's side door was kicked open before the vehicle had even fully stopped. Caroline practically fell out of the heavy door, her designer heels clicking frantically against the concrete. She was completely unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant socialite who had sneered at me in the courtroom just days ago. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and her eyes were wide with a feral, hysterical panic. She held her gold-plated smartphone in her shaking hand like a weapon. "I knew it!" Caroline screamed, her voice cracking and echoing violently in the damp underground air. She marched straight past me, entirely focused on her husband. "I tracked your location on your phone. You lying, backstabbing coward!" DeAndre froze, the profound relief of his newly signed immunity deal immediately replaced by absolute dread. "Caroline, you need to leave," he said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Right now. This does not involve you." "Does not involve me," she shrieked, striking DeAndre in the chest with her open palm. "You are selling out my brother. You are selling out our entire family, the family that gave you absolutely everything." DeAndre took a step back, but Caroline relentlessly advanced her rage, blinding her to the reality of the situation. She unleashed a vicious torrent of insults, stripping away the polite corporate facade they had maintained for years. "You were nothing before my father gave you a seat at the table," Caroline yelled, her face turning an ugly shade of red. "You were just a mid-level accountant with a cheap degree. We gave you the house. We gave you the cars. We made you a Kensington. You should be kissing the ground my brother walks on. And you betray us for her." She spun around to face me, her expression contorted with pure, venomous hatred. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my chest. "And you. You think you are so powerful now because you have a government radio and a tactical vest. You are nothing. You will always be the cheap, pathetic girl who bought her clothes on clearance. You infiltrated our family because you were obsessed with our wealth. You could never be one of us, so you decided to destroy us." I did not raise my weapon. I did not even break my stride. I simply looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of someone observing a trapped animal losing its mind. I did not have time for the hysterical delusions of a ruined socialite. "Your family is currently facing multiple federal treason charges, Caroline," I said smoothly, my voice cutting through her frantic screaming. "Your mother's offshore trust accounts are entirely frozen. Your brother is a fugitive who just kidnapped my son. And your husband just signed a full federal confession. What exactly is there left to be obsessed with? My family has friends in Washington." Caroline screamed, refusing to accept reality. "We have judges on our payroll. We have state senators on speed dial. You cannot do this to us. We are the Kensingtons. We will hire the best lawyers in the country, and we will crush you. Give me whatever he just gave you. Take the deal back." She lunged toward me, but DeAndre finally snapped. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back with a sudden, forceful authority she had clearly never seen from him before. "It is over, Caroline!" DeAndre yelled, his deep voice booming off the concrete ceiling. The years of quiet subservience to her racist, entitled family finally shattered. "Open your eyes and look around. The empire is dead. Your brother used me to launder his dirty money, and he was perfectly willing to send me to federal prison to save his own skin. I am saving my own life." Caroline struggled against his grip, sobbing hysterically. "You are ruining my life," she cried, hitting his shoulders. I stepped forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous, commanding register that instantly silenced her. "Caroline, take one more step toward a federal officer or a protected government witness, and I will have you arrested right now for obstruction of justice and assault." She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at me, the terrifying reality of my authority, finally piercing her delusional bubble. "Your husband just saved himself from 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary," I continued coldly. "If you had a single ounce of sense, you would get back in your car, drive to a cheap motel, and figure out how you are going to pay for your own defense attorney. Because by tomorrow morning, the federal government is seizing that luxury SUV too." I did not wait for her response. I walked around the front of her vehicle and pressed the elevator call button. As the metal doors slid open, I looked back one last time. Caroline was slumped against the side of her car, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, while DeAndre stood feet away, entirely unwilling to comfort her. Their toxic, financially motivated marriage was officially dead. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the roof. I had a helicopter waiting and a husband to hunt down. As the heavy metal doors of the elevator began to slide shut, I caught one final glimpse of the underground garage. Caroline had completely unraveled. She dropped to her knees on the cold, dirty concrete, her expensive designer gown soaking up the dark oil stains left by parked cars. She was screaming at DeAndre, her face buried in her hands, but the thick doors sealed away her hysterical cries. DeAndre did not even look down at her. I watched through the narrow gap as he got into his car and drove away, leaving his wife entirely alone in the echoing darkness. Her perfect suburban life, built entirely on stolen corporate money and arrogant entitlement, was officially over. She had spent years treating me like absolute garbage, convinced her wealth made her untouchable. Now she was going home to an empty, seized mansion with absolutely nothing to her name. The elevator surged upward, pressing my boots firmly against the floor. I looked down at the small black flash drive resting in the palm of my hand. I secured it inside the waterproof pocket of my tactical vest and zipped it shut. This tiny piece of plastic and metal was the ultimate weapon. It held the culmination of 5 years of psychological torture, late-night data mining, and silent endurance. I had played the submissive, uneducated housewife flawlessly, letting Richard and his family believe they were superior in every possible way. They thought my silence was weakness. They never realized it was the disciplined focus of an intelligence officer building an airtight federal treason case. The elevator chimed and the doors opened to the roof of the federal building. The deafening roar of a Black Hawk helicopter immediately filled my ears. The massive rotor blades whipped the cold night air into a violent frenzy. 2 heavily armed tactical agents were already strapped into the back, checking their automatic weapons. The lead agent stood by the open side door, holding his hand out to help me aboard. I grabbed his arm, pulled myself into the vibrating cabin, and strapped a heavy communications headset over my ears. "Take off," I ordered the pilot through the radio channel. "We have the coordinates." The helicopter banked sharply, lifting off the rooftop and soaring over the brightly lit Manhattan skyline. I pulled my secure mobile terminal from my vest and connected DeAndre's decrypted flash drive. The screen instantly populated with Richard's exact extraction logistics. DeAndre had not lied. Richard was heading to a remote, abandoned logging airstrip hidden deep within the dense forests of upstate New York, roughly 50 miles north of the city limits. He had a private charter jet waiting to smuggle him and his stolen military tech funds into international airspace. I transmitted the flight path directly to the pilot's navigation console. "We are heading north," I announced to the tactical team sitting across from me. "He thinks he has a massive head start because he cut his electronic ankle monitor. He thinks driving a stolen commercial truck makes him completely invisible to highway patrol." The lead agent leaned forward, his face illuminated by the green glow of the tactical monitors. "Do we have a visual on the boy?" I pulled up a secondary tracking program on my screen. A small, pulsing red dot appeared on the digital map, moving steadily up the interstate toward the airstrip. "Yes," I replied, my voice devoid of the panic Richard expected me to feel. "When I packed my son's overnight bag last week, I sewed a military-grade encrypted GPS tracker deep inside the lining of his favorite stuffed animal. Richard is far too arrogant and oblivious to ever check a child's toy. He thinks he took my son to punish me. He actually just handed me a real-time beacon to his exact location." The agents nodded, deeply impressed by the cold calculation. We flew in silence for several minutes, the dark expanse of the upstate forests rushing by beneath us. I looked out the window into the black night. Richard was a cornered animal now. His corporate empire was destroyed. His family had completely turned against him to save themselves. His financial architect had traded his secrets for federal immunity. He had absolutely nothing left except his massive ego and a desperate delusion that he could still win. "Prepare your weapons," I instructed the team as the pilot signaled we were 10 minutes away from the drop zone. "Richard is extremely unstable, but he is a coward at heart. We secure the child first, and then we take the CEO down. He thought he could sell out his country and discard his family like trash. Tonight, we show him exactly what happens when you underestimate the woman you sleep next to. The Black Hawk helicopter descended rapidly through the heavy cloud cover, the dark expanse of the upstate New York wilderness rushing up to meet us. The pilot flipped a series of overhead switches, killing all exterior navigation lights. We became a massive silent shadow hunting in the night. I stared at the tactical monitor strapped to my thigh. The pulsing red dot representing my son's GPS tracker had finally stopped moving. He was stationary at the exact coordinates DeAndre had provided. The abandoned logging airstrip. "We are 2 miles out," the pilot announced over the secure radio channel. "I am picking up a heat signature on the infrared cameras. One commercial vehicle abandoned near the tree line. One mid-sized private jet, idling on the cracked tarmac." "Put us down in the clearing 1/2 mile south of the runway," I ordered, checking the magazine of my sidearm one final time. We approach on foot through the woods. If Richard hears the heavy rotors of a military helicopter hovering directly over his escape route, his extreme paranoia will take over. He is highly unstable. I will not risk him using my son as a human shield in a panic. The helicopter flared its nose and touched down violently in a field of tall, frozen grass. The side doors slid open. I jumped out into the freezing night air, followed immediately by 12 heavily armed tactical agents wearing advanced night vision optics. We moved with absolute terrifying silence. My expensive designer suit from the gala felt out of place in the mud and sharp branches, but I did not care. I pushed through the dense brush, my years of rigorous intelligence field training seamlessly taking over. The quiet, submissive house spouse was completely gone. I was a federal officer securing a high-value hostage. We breached the tree line just as the heavy cloud cover broke, allowing pale moonlight to illuminate the ruined airstrip. We spread out in a wide, tactical semicircle, completely boxing in the runway from the shadows. Through my optic scope, I finally got a visual on the target. A sleek black Gulfstream jet was parked at the far end of the tarmac. Its engines emitted a low, continuous whine, ready for an immediate takeoff. Standing at the base of the metal boarding stairs was Richard. He looked completely unhinged. His expensive tuxedo jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was torn and covered in dirt from his desperate flight through the woods. In his right hand, he clutched a heavy canvas duffel bag. I knew exactly what was inside. Patricia's emergency stash of untraceable diamonds and forged international passports. In his left hand, he tightly gripped the tiny wrist of my 5-year-old son. My boy was shivering in the cold night air, openly sobbing. He was wearing his superhero pajamas, desperately clutching his favorite stuffed brown bear to his chest, the exact bear housing the encrypted military tracker. Seeing my child crying and terrified made the blood roar in my ears, but I forced my heart rate down. Emotion gets you killed. Precision wins the war. Richard dragged the crying boy toward the jet. "Stop crying!" Richard barked, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet tarmac. "Stop it right now. We are going on a trip. You are going to be fine." He was not comforting his son. He was commanding him, treating the terrified child like a piece of defective corporate hardware that refused to reboot. Richard reached the metal stairs and looked up at the pilot who was standing on the top step. The pilot wore a dark flight suit, a heavy jacket, and dark aviator glasses despite the midnight hour. "Get the engines fully spooled," Richard ordered, frantically throwing the heavy canvas bag onto the stairs. He believed he was still the untouchable CEO. He believed his money commanded absolute loyalty from everyone he hired. "There is $2 million in uncut stones in that bag. It is completely untraceable. The federal government froze my domestic accounts, but that pays for the flight to the non-extradition zone and buys your permanent silence. Now get in the cockpit and take off." The pilot did not move. He did not reach for the bag of diamonds. He just stood there, an immovable shadow against the bright cabin lights of the jet staring down at the ruined billionaire. The engines continued their steady, indifferent hum. "Did you hear me?" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure desperation. The facade of the brilliant tech mastermind was completely shattered. He was just a pathetic, terrified criminal trying to buy his way out of treason. He pointed a shaking finger at the pilot. I hired you for this exact contingency. You work for me. If we do not leave this airstrip in the next 60 seconds, the federal government is going to lock us both away forever. Move your feet right now. I held up a closed fist, signaling my tactical team to hold their positions in the dark tree line. I wanted Richard to feel the absolute crushing weight of his failure. I wanted him to believe he had actually made it right up until the exact moment I ripped his false reality to pieces. The pilot slowly turned his head, completely unbothered by Richard's frantic screaming. He reached up, pulling off his dark aviator glasses, and let them hang casually from the collar of his flight suit. I do not work for you, Mr. Kensington, the pilot said, his voice projecting clearly over the deafening whine of the jet engines. He reached inside his heavy leather flight jacket. He did not pull out a flight manifest or a map. He pulled out a gold shield. Federal Bureau of Investigation, the pilot announced, his tone dripping with absolute authority. Cut the engines right now. Richard froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The heavy canvas bag of diamonds slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the metal boarding stairs with a dull, heavy thud. The zipper burst open, spilling several velvet pouches onto the cold, cracked tarmac. Millions of dollars in untraceable stones scattered uselessly around his polished shoes. The brilliant tech billionaire, the man who believed his wealth made him a god, suddenly realized he was nothing more than a trapped rat in a federal cage. He instinctively tightened his grip on our son. My boy let out a sharp cry of pain, his small hands clutching his stuffed brown bear. That was the only signal I needed. I dropped my fist. The tactical team surged forward from the dark tree line, moving with terrifying silent precision. Simultaneously, the dark woods at the far end of the runway erupted with blinding high-intensity strobe lights. 3 heavily armored tactical vehicles tore onto the cracked asphalt, their massive tires screeching as they completely boxed in the black Gulfstream jet. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly onto the illuminated tarmac. The harsh floodlights from the armored vehicles cast long, dramatic shadows across the runway. My tactical boots clicked steadily against the asphalt. I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, unstoppable, measured pace of an executioner approaching the block. Richard saw me. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Natalie. He choked out, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whisper. He pulled our crying son tighter against his chest, backing up a step until his shoulders hit the exterior of the jet. Stay back. If any of you come closer, I swear to God I will not let him go. You swear to God what, Richard? I asked, smoothly, stopping exactly 10 feet from the base of the metal stairs. Do you honestly think you are in a position to make threats? You are surrounded by federal agents. Your pilot is an undercover operative, your mother's offshore trust accounts were frozen 3 hours ago, and your brother-in-law handed me your fully decrypted master ledger before dinner. You have absolutely nothing left. Your entire empire is gone. Richard's eyes darted wildly around the runway. He looked at the red laser sights painting the center of his chest. He looked at the armored vehicles blocking his plane. He looked down at the diamonds scattered at his feet. The absolute crushing reality of his situation finally broke him. He began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving under his torn white dress shirt. You planned this, Richard sobbed, tears streaming down his face. You set me up. You faked our entire marriage. You are an absolute monster. I took another step forward. My eyes locked onto his. I did not fake anything, Richard. I loved you. I was a loyal, devoted wife. But 3 years ago, when you brought your young marketing assistant into our marital bed and you allowed your mother and sister to humiliate me every single day, that was when the woman you married died. The CIA did not embed me in your house. I personally submitted the request to be reactivated so I could tear your life apart with my own 2 hands. Richard shook his head, completely unable to process the magnitude of his own catastrophic mistakes. How did you get into the servers? He pleaded, his ego demanding an answer, even as his life ended. The encryption was flawless. I let out a cold, sharp laugh that echoed over the dying whine of the jet engines. Flawless. Richard, you are incredibly predictable. You secured your illegal arms deals with military-grade encryption, but you changed the master administrative password to your mistress's birthday because you thought it was romantic. You literally handed me the keys to your federal prison cell. Now let my son go. Richard looked down at the terrified little boy in his arms. He looked back at me, his eyes entirely hollow. Slowly, his arms went limp. He released his grip. My son scrambled down the metal stairs, running toward me with his arms outstretched. I holstered my sidearm and dropped to one knee, catching him in a tight, fiercely protective embrace. I buried my face in his hair, the cold tactical officer momentarily replaced by a fiercely loving mother. "You are safe now, sweetie," I whispered into his ear. "Move in," I ordered over the radio, standing up and holding my son securely behind me. The tactical agents swarmed the stairs. They grabbed Richard, forcing him face down onto the cold tarmac. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the night air. The untouchable CEO of Kensington Tech was finally in chains, weeping openly in the dirt, surrounded by the useless diamonds his arrogant mother had provided. The nightmare was officially over. The tactical agents pulled Richard up from the cold asphalt, his hands securely fastened behind his back. The heavy steel handcuffs gleamed under the harsh floodlights of the armored vehicles. He was shivering, his torn dress shirt clinging to his sweating skin. As they dragged the completely broken tech billionaire toward the transport van, my lead agent knelt on the cracked runway to collect the scattered evidence. He shined his tactical flashlight over the velvet pouches that had burst open. "These are uncut," the agent noted, carefully bagging the stones. "Millions of dollars in raw diamonds. There is no serial number, no laser etching. They are completely untraceable on the global market. Where does a corporate CEO suddenly get his hands on a black market currency like this?" I knew exactly where. I looked at Richard, who was now slumped against the side of the federal transport, weeping openly, as the adrenaline completely abandoned his system. I walked over to him, holding my son safely behind my leg. "Your mother gave them to you," I stated, my voice offering absolutely no sympathy. Richard nodded weakly, his chin resting on his chest. In his absolute desperation, any lingering loyalty to his family instantly vanished. He wanted to mitigate his own sentence, and he was ready to trade his mother's freedom for a lighter security classification. He began to confess rapidly, the words spilling out of his mouth in a pathetic rush. He detailed exactly how the kidnapping had been meticulously orchestrated earlier that afternoon, proving it was not just a crime of passion, but a calculated conspiracy. He told the federal agents how Patricia had actively aided and abetted him. When Caroline had rushed home to announce that DeAndre had handed over the master ledger, Patricia realized the financial empire was dead. Instead of advising her son to surrender, she had unlocked a hidden floor safe beneath the library desk. She had handed him the canvas bag of untraceable diamonds, explicitly instructing him to use the stones to fund his life on the run in a non-extradition country. But she did not just provide the funding. Richard confessed that Patricia had helped him plan the extraction at the school. She had drawn out a map of the elite private school's blind spots. Richard explained how he had violated the temporary custody order to pull our young son out of his afternoon classes. He had bypassed the main security checkpoint using Patricia's elite VIP parent credentials, which she had willingly handed over to him. Once inside, Richard had completely ignored the emergency custody injunction the family court had issued just days prior. He walked straight onto the playground, physically intimidated a young teacher who tried to verify his pickup authorization, and grabbed my son by the arm. He then dragged the terrified child through a blind service exit that his mother had specifically mapped out for him, avoiding the primary security cameras before stealing the gardener's truck to head north. I listened to his confession with icy precision. Patricia had always prided herself on having clean hands. She liked to sit in her ivory tower judging my clothes and my background, while her son did the dirty work of maintaining their immense wealth. But by actively funding a federal fugitive and conspiring to kidnap a child across state lines, she had finally permanently crossed the line into undeniable criminal territory. She was no longer just a bankrupt socialite mourning the loss of her trust funds. She was a co-conspirator to a federal kidnapping. I reached for the heavy radio clipped to my tactical vest. "Command, this is Agent Kensington," I transmitted clearly. "The primary target is secure. The hostage is safe. However, based on an immediate field confession, I need a secondary arrest team dispatched to the Kensington estate in Connecticut immediately. Copy that?" Command replied through the earpiece. "Identify the secondary target. The target is Patricia Kensington." I ordered, my eyes locked on Richard, who was now being shoved into the back of the transport van. Charges include aiding and abetting a known federal fugitive conspiracy to commit child kidnapping, violating a federal custody injunction, and attempting to finance an international escape with untraceable black market assets. Do not afford her any elite courtesies. Bring her in handcuffs. Understood. Tactical units are 5 minutes out from the estate. I released the transmit button. The untouchable matriarch was about to face the ultimate reality check. She had spent 5 years treating me like I was completely worthless, entirely beneath her elite family pedigree. She had tried to help steal my child to punish me. Now the very government she thought she could outsmart was kicking down her custom oak doors. I wrapped my tactical jacket around my shivering son, picked him up, and walked toward the waiting helicopter. The night was finally over, and the Kensington family was entirely destroyed. I strapped my son securely into the heavy seat of the Black Hawk helicopter, wrapping the oversized tactical jacket tighter around his small shoulders. He buried his face against my chest, his tears finally stopping as the rhythmic vibration of the massive rotors lulled him into a state of sheer exhaustion. As the helicopter lifted off the cracked asphalt of the abandoned upstate runway and banked south toward Manhattan, the blinding adrenaline that had fueled me for the past 12 hours began to recede. Sitting in the dim red tactical lighting of the cabin, my mind meticulously processed the chaotic timeline of the chase. I vividly remembered the exact moment the alert had triggered earlier that afternoon. I had been standing in the Federal Command Center reviewing DeAndre's decrypted ledger when the red emergency line flashed. An agent reported that Richard's ankle monitor had gone dark and a panic alarm had been tripped at the elite private elementary school. In that fraction of a second, the universe had tested me. A normal mother would have collapsed. A normal suburban wife would have fallen to her knees screaming and crying in pure paralyzing terror. Richard had counted on that exact hysterical reaction. He had banked his entire escape plan on the assumption that my emotional devastation would buy him a massive head start. He was completely wrong. There was no crying mother routine. The moment I heard my son had been taken, the maternal panic was instantly compartmentalized and locked away behind a wall of cold, lethal intelligence training. I did not shed a single tear. I transformed immediately from a mother into a tactical commander. The first major obstacle in the chase had not been Richard. It had been the local Connecticut law enforcement. When the school's panic alarm initially triggered, the local precinct had responded with infuriating, deliberate slowness. The remaining officers in that wealthy suburban department were still fiercely loyal to the recently arrested police chief. They were deeply embedded in the Kensington payroll. When I had first contacted the local dispatch to order an immediate lockdown of the state highways, the desk sergeant had casually dismissed the kidnapping as a simple high-net-worth custody misunderstanding. He insisted that Richard was a respected billionaire CEO who just wanted to spend the afternoon with his boy. I did not waste time arguing with a corrupt local cop over the phone. I used my federal clearance to completely override their entire municipal grid. I bypassed their local dispatch, commandeered their encrypted radio frequencies, and locked them out of their own traffic camera networks. I broadcasted a direct recorded message across every local police radio channel in the county. I stated that the chief executive of Kensington Tech was now a designated federal fugitive, wanted for international espionage and kidnapping, and any local officer found obstructing the pursuit would be immediately arrested for federal treason. The local department went dead silent, and the state roadblocks instantly went up. With the corrupt local interference neutralized, I had focused the entire weight of the intelligence agency on tracking Richard's digital footprint. He was arrogant enough to believe that driving a stolen commercial landscaping truck made him an invisible ghost. He had thrown his expensive smartphone out the window miles ago, but I knew his psychological profile perfectly. He was a narcissist who needed to feel in control, which meant he would never travel without a line of communication to his foreign buyers. He was using an encrypted burner phone, a device he thought was completely untraceable. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had married. During my time embedded in his house, I had memorized the unique signal band his black market devices operated on. I directed the federal satellite network to sweep the entire northeastern seaboard for that specific encrypted frequency. Within minutes, we caught a massive ping bouncing off a rural cell tower. I cross-referenced that signal with the military-grade GPS tracker I had sewn into my son's stuffed bear. The two data points overlapped perfectly, creating an inescapable digital net moving steadily north toward the logging airstrip. The chase had been a flawless surgical strike. Richard thought he was playing a game of chess against a helpless housewife. He never realized he was playing against a federal algorithm designed to hunt terrorists. The helicopter suddenly pitched downward, breaking my intense reflection. I looked out the window as the bright, sprawling skyline of New York City appeared below us. We were descending toward the secure landing pad on the roof of the federal building. The chase was officially over, and the extraction was a complete success. I held my sleeping son tighter against my chest. Tomorrow the sun would rise on a completely different world. Tomorrow the legal slaughter of the Kensington family would begin in a federal courtroom. Tomorrow the legal slaughter of the Kensington family would begin in a federal courtroom. But as I sat in my secure office at the intelligence agency the next morning preparing the final evidence binders for the grand jury, I needed to review the exact sequence of events that had occurred at the airstrip before I arrived. The federal prosecutors had acquired the rusted security camera footage from the logging facility, and combined with the audio wire worn by our undercover pilot, it painted a pathetic, crystal-clear picture of a billionaire's final moments of perceived power. To fully understand the absolute delusion Richard was operating under, you have to look at what he did 30 minutes before my helicopter touched down. Despite his young marketing assistant fleeing from the charity gala in absolute terror earlier that evening, Richard refused to let her go. From the cab of the stolen gardener's truck, he had frantically called her. He used the only language he actually understood, which was money. He offered her $2 million from his mother's bag of untraceable diamonds if she met him at the extraction point. Her greed easily overpowered her self-preservation. She had taken a high-speed private car service to the remote location, arriving just before Richard. The security footage showed her standing near the edge of the cracked tarmac. She was shivering in the freezing upstate wind, wearing a thin trench coat over her expensive designer gown. She looked around at the dark, isolated forest, with clear regret nervously clutching her purse. Minutes later, the stolen landscaping truck careened onto the asphalt, its headlights cutting erratically through the darkness. Richard slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding violently before coming to a halt. He practically threw himself out of the driver's seat. He marched around to the passenger side and dragged my frightened son out of the cabin, completely ignoring the child's tears. Richard did not greet his mistress. He did not ask if she was cold or okay. He simply marched toward the idling black Gulfstream jet, pulling my crying son along by the wrist. He was running on pure narcissistic adrenaline, entirely convinced that his immense wealth placed him above the consequences of his actions. A small two-man ground crew was standing near the wing, finalizing the fueling process for the aircraft. Richard did not treat them like human beings. He treated them like annoying obstacles in his path. "Hurry it up!" Richard screamed at the older mechanic handling the heavy fuel line. His voice echoed sharply on the undercover audio wire. "I am not paying a premium for a private charter to watch you move in slow motion. Disconnect that hose right now." The mechanic, who was actually a highly trained federal tactical agent playing a role, calmly tried to explain standard safety protocols. He stated that interrupting the fuel pressure prematurely could cause a dangerous spill on the tarmac. Richard completely lost his temper. He reached into his torn dress pants and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills he had taken from his home safe. He threw the cash aggressively at the mechanic's chest. The bills separated in the wind, fluttering uselessly to the cold asphalt. "I do not care about your safety protocols," Richard barked, pointing a shaking finger at the undercover agent. "My wealth dictates the schedule tonight. If this plane is not wheels up in 5 minutes, I will make sure neither of you ever works in aviation again. Leave the money on the ground and get the stairs down." My son was terrified by the screaming. He clung tightly to his stuffed brown bear, shivering in his thin superhero pajamas. He had never seen his father act like a deranged maniac before. "Stop crying," Richard snapped at him, shaking his small arm. "You are embarrassing me. We are going to a place where nobody can tell us what to do. Stop acting like a baby." The mistress finally stepped forward, attempting to intervene. She gently touched Richard's shoulder. "Richard, you are scaring him," she whispered nervously. He turned on her with vicious, blinding speed. "I paid you $2 million to get on this plane and look pretty." He hissed, his face inches from hers. "Do not tell me how to handle my own property." She flinched, stepping back in horror. In that single moment, the illusion of the polished, suave CEO was completely shattered for her. She was looking at a desperate, abusive criminal, and she finally realized that the diamonds he promised her might actually cost her her life. Richard pushed past the stunned ground crew and forced his way toward the metal boarding stairs. He thought his money had bought his absolute freedom. He believed his arrogance made him faster than the law. He had absolutely no idea that the older mechanic ignoring the $100 bills was federal law enforcement. He had no idea that the pilot waiting inside the cabin was the FBI. He was completely blind to the fact that his entire grand escape was a carefully orchestrated federal trap. He tossed his canvas bag of diamonds onto the stairs, completely convinced he had won. That was the exact moment he looked up, and my Black Hawk helicopter breached the tree line. The deafening roar of my Black Hawk helicopter, tearing through the tree line, sent Richard into a state of absolute blind panic. The massive rotor blades whipped the freezing upstate air into a violent storm, blowing dead leaves and loose debris across the cracked asphalt of the runway. Richard looked up at the massive military aircraft descending from the dark sky, and his arrogant confidence instantly evaporated. He realized the federal government had found him, but his narcissistic mind still believed he could somehow outrun a tactical strike team. He completely abandoned his young mistress on the tarmac. He did not even look back as she shielded her face from the rotor wash and ran toward the tree line to hide. Richard grabbed the heavy canvas bag of diamonds with his free hand and practically dragged my terrified son up the metal boarding stairs of the Gulfstream jet. He threw the bag into the luxurious cabin, the uncut stones clinking heavily against the polished wood floor, and shoved my crying boy into one of the plush white leather passenger seats. "Sit down and strap in." Richard screamed, his voice completely unhinged. He fumbled with the heavy aviation seatbelt, forcefully clicking it across my son's small chest. "I am not letting her take you. We are leaving right now." My son was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching his stuffed brown bear to his face. He was completely trapped in a nightmare created entirely by his father's greed. Richard did not offer a single word of comfort. He turned his back on the child and sprinted up the narrow aisle toward the open cockpit door. The pilot was sitting calmly in the left seat, bathed in the soft green glow of the instrument panels. He was wearing a dark leather flight jacket and heavy aviator glasses, his hands resting casually on his lap instead of gripping the yoke. The engines were still whining at idle, but the plane was not moving an inch. "What are you waiting for?" Richard shrieked, slamming his hands against the cockpit bulkhead. He pointed frantically out the small windshield toward the runway. "There is a military helicopter landing right behind us. They found the airstrip. Push the throttles to maximum and take off right now. I do not care about the pre-flight checks. I do not care about the ground crew. Move this plane." The pilot did not flinch at the screaming billionaire. He did not reach for the engine controls. Instead, he slowly reached up to the overhead panel and began flipping a series of heavy metal switches. The high-pitched whine of the jet engines began to wind down, dropping rapidly in pitch until it was nothing more than a mechanical hum. The bright cabin lights flickered and died, replaced by dim emergency floor lighting. "What are you doing?" Richard gasped, his chest heaving as the reality of the dying engines registered in his panicked brain. "Are you insane? I told you I have $2 million in untraceable diamonds sitting in the cabin. I can double it. I can pay you whatever you want. Turn those engines back on and fly me out of here." The pilot calmly unbuckled his 5-point safety harness. He turned around slowly in his seat to face Richard. He reached up and pulled off his dark aviator glasses, letting them hang from his jacket collar. He looked at the ruined tech CEO with an expression of absolute clinical disgust. "I do not work for you, Mr. Kensington," the pilot said smoothly, his voice completely steady and devoid of fear. "I do not care about your offshore accounts, and I certainly do not care about your stolen diamonds." The pilot reached inside his heavy leather jacket. He did not pull out a flight map or a customized navigation tablet. He pulled out a solid gold shield enclosed in a black leather wallet and held it up directly in front of Richard's face. "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The pilot announced, his tone dripping with absolute authority. "This aircraft is grounded by order of the United States Department of Justice. You are not going to a non-extradition zone tonight. You are going to a federal holding cell." Richard physically stumbled backward, hitting his shoulder against the narrow cabin wall. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His brain simply could not process the magnitude of his absolute failure. He looked at the FBI badge, then looked out the small oval window. Outside, the Black Hawk helicopter had touched down. Heavily armed tactical agents were already swarming the tarmac, their weapons drawn and red laser sights cutting through the darkness. The undercover ground crew mechanic had pulled his own weapon and was currently securing the perimeter of the stairs. The entire escape plan had been a meticulously designed federal trap. The encrypted communication channel Richard thought he was using to contact a black market smuggler had actually been entirely compromised by my intelligence team days ago. We had supplied the pilot, we had chosen the remote airstrip, we had orchestrated every single detail of his desperate flight to ensure he walked willingly into a contained, heavily armed federal net. Richard sank to his knees in the narrow aisle of the luxury jet. He looked at my crying son strapped into the leather seat, and then he looked at the canvas bag of diamonds resting uselessly on the floor. His massive corporate empire, his purchased political influence, and his arrogant family pedigree meant absolutely nothing inside the steel trap I had built for him. The sting operation was flawlessly executed. The hunt was over, and it was finally time for me to board the plane and finish the job. I stepped out of the Black Hawk helicopter and my boots hit the cold asphalt of the runway. The night was completely fractured by the blinding, strobing blue and red lights of the tactical SWAT vehicles that had aggressively flooded the airstrip. They moved in perfect synchronization, massive armored trucks boxing the black Gulfstream jet in from every conceivable angle. Heavily armed agents poured out, taking defensive positions behind reinforced doors, their weapons trained directly on the aircraft's fuselage. A specialized extraction team flanked me as I walked toward the metal boarding stairs. The deafening noise of the chopper blades faded into the background as my focus narrowed entirely on the open cabin door. I walked up the stairs slowly. I did not draw my weapon. I did not need to. The psychological dominance I held in this moment was far more lethal than any firearm. I stepped over the spilled velvet pouches of uncut diamonds that littered the top step and entered the luxurious cabin. Richard was scrambling up from the floor. When he saw me step through the doorway, his sheer panic mutated into cornered desperation. He lunged toward the white leather passenger seat, frantically tearing at the heavy aviation buckle that secured our crying son. He ripped the child out of the seat, pulling the boy's small back tightly against his chest. He wrapped his arm aggressively around our son's shoulders, backing himself into the narrow space near the emergency exit. "Stay exactly where you are," Richard screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical, breathless register. He was hyperventilating, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow gasps. "Do not take another step, Natalie. I mean it. Tell your agents to back off right now. My son whimpered, his face stained with tears, still clutching his stuffed brown bear. Mommy is right here, I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft and steady. I ignored Richard completely for a moment to establish eye contact with my child. You are doing so great, sweetheart. Just hold on to your bear. This will all be over in a minute. Richard shook his head violently, sweat pouring down his pale face. No, it is not over. He yelled, his grip tightening. You are going to clear the runway. You are going to tell that fake pilot to get out of the cockpit, and you are going to let me fly this plane myself. I have a pilot license. I can fly it. If you do not move those trucks, I swear you will regret it. I am his father. I have rights. I stood absolutely still in the center of the cabin aisle. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I simply stared at him with an expression of profound boredom. You are negotiating with a ghost, Richard. I replied, my voice slicing effortlessly through his frantic shouting. Look at yourself. You are hyperventilating. You have no flight plan. You have no co-pilot. You are completely surrounded by federal agents with standing orders to drop you the second you pose a lethal threat to that child. What exactly is your leverage here? I have him. Richard choked out, pointing desperately at the boy in his arms. That is my leverage. You love him. You will not risk him getting hurt. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The FBI pilot, still sitting in the cockpit, slowly turned his seat, his hand resting comfortably on his holstered weapon, ready to intervene. You are absolutely right, I said coldly. I love him. Which is why I am perfectly willing to put a bullet through your knee right now if you do not let him go. But let us look at the reality of your situation, Richard. You are currently facing federal charges for international treason, corporate espionage, and massive financial fraud. That carries a mandatory minimum of 25 years. By holding a child hostage against a federal officer, you are elevating this to an aggravated kidnapping charge. You are turning a life sentence into a guaranteed trip to a maximum security solitary confinement cell. You will never see the sky again. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the small cabin. He looked at the FBI pilot. He looked at the heavily armed agents waiting just outside the door. He looked down at the uncut diamonds scattered uselessly across the floor. The suffocating weight of his total failure finally crushed the last remaining spark of his arrogance. He thought his wealth made him a king. He thought his corporate title gave him immunity from the laws that governed ordinary people. But standing in that jet stripped of his money, his lawyers, and his enablers, he was nothing but a terrified coward. Let him go, Richard. I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. Do it now. His shoulders sagged. The frantic energy that had fueled his desperate escape completely drained from his body. He was trembling violently as he slowly loosened his grip. He released his arms, stepping back until he hit the cabin wall. He slid down the polished wood paneling, burying his face in his hands, and began to sob uncontrollably. My son immediately ran toward me. I caught him burying my face in his hair, the intense smell of jet fuel and cold air clinging to his pajamas. I held him tightly, signaling the tactical agents waiting on the stairs. They flooded the cabin, instantly bypassing me and descending upon Richard. They hauled the weeping billionaire to his feet forcefully, securing his wrists in heavy steel cuffs. The tarmac showdown was finished. I carried my son out of the plane and into the cool night air, leaving Richard to his inevitable, miserable fate. I carried my son down the metal boarding stairs, shielding his face from the flashing blue and red lights of the tactical vehicles. The cold night air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and exhaust. I handed my boy to a waiting female EMT, instructing her to get him into a heated SUV and wrap him in a thermal blanket. I watched him securely buckle into the back seat of the federal vehicle before I turned my attention back to the black Gulfstream jet. The tactical agents were dragging Richard down the stairs. He stumbled over his own polished shoes, his hands awkwardly pinned behind his back by the heavy steel handcuffs. The velvet pouches of uncut diamonds remained scattered on the steps, completely ignored by the federal officers. When Richard's feet finally hit the asphalt, The shock of his arrest seemed to wear off, instantly replaced by a toxic defensive rage. He dug the heels of his shoes into the tarmac, refusing to walk any further toward the transport van. "You are a monster!" Richard screamed, his voice raw and echoing across the quiet runway. He twisted his body, trying to face me directly as the agents held him firmly by the shoulders. "You set this whole thing up from the very beginning. You never loved me. You faked our entire marriage just to build a case for your agency. You are a cold, calculating sociopath." He was projecting. He was trying to cast himself as the tragic victim of a government conspiracy rather than a greedy traitor who got caught. He looked at the federal agents, raising his chin in a pathetic attempt to regain his lost authority. "She lied to all of you," Richard yelled, spit flying from his lips. "She infiltrated my home. She manipulated my mother and my sister. She used my own son as a pawn to steal my company. She is the real criminal here." I slowly walked over to him. The tactical agents tightened their grip on his arms, ensuring he could not lunge at me. I stood just 2 feet away, looking at the man I had once promised to spend the rest of my life with. His designer tuxedo pants were ruined, his white shirt was stained with dirt and sweat, and his perfectly styled hair was a frantic mess. "I did not fake anything, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through his hysterical shouting with absolute icy clarity. "I loved you. When we stood at the altar 5 years ago, I meant every single vow. I actually resigned from active field duty because I wanted to build a real life with you. I wanted a family. I tolerated your arrogant mother and your vicious sister because I thought you were worth the sacrifice. I was a loyal, devoted wife." Richard scoffed, a bitter, trembling sound. "You expect me to believe that? You are a CIA operative. You were planted in my house." I shook my head slowly, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of closure. "I was not planted, Richard. I was retired. But 3 years ago, I came home early from a grocery run. I walked upstairs and I found you in our marital bed with your 22-year-old marketing assistant." The color drained from his face for the second time that night. His angry, defiant posture immediately collapsed. "That was the day the woman you married died." I continued, stepping even closer so he could not look away from my eyes. "I did not scream. I did not file for divorce and demand half of your assets. Instead, I drove to a secure federal facility and submitted a formal request to have my intelligence credentials reactivated. I spent the last 3 years smiling at you over the dinner table while I meticulously dismantled your entire existence. You brought this entirely upon yourself." Richard was shaking his head, his breathing shallow. The encryption, he mumbled, his mind completely broken by the revelation. "How did you get through the basement firewalls? DeAndre said it would take a supercomputer a decade to crack those servers." I let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Your encryption was state-of-the-art, Richard. You spent millions securing your illegal weapons tech sales. But you are incredibly arrogant, and you think you are the smartest person in any room. You changed the primary administrative Wi-Fi password for the entire estate to your mistress's birthday. You thought it was a clever, romantic little secret right under my nose. You literally handed me the master key to your kingdom. I bypassed your $1 million firewalls from my laptop on the living room couch while you were sleeping next to me." Richard let out a strangled gasp, his knees buckling. The federal agents had to pull upward to keep him from collapsing completely onto the asphalt. He finally realized the absolute depth of his stupidity. His own infidelity, his own narcissism, and his own careless arrogance had destroyed his empire. "Put him in the van," I ordered the agents, turning my back on him for the final time. The ultimate payoff was complete. The invincible CEO was nothing but a broken man heading to a concrete cell, and I was going home to the life I had successfully reclaimed. 3 months later, the heavy mahogany doors of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse swung shut, sealing out the noise of the city. I sat in the front row of the gallery, positioned directly behind the prosecution table. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. The atmosphere in this room was vastly different from the chaotic family court hearing where this entire operation had begun. There was no arrogant smirking today. There was no dismissive laughter from wealthy relatives. There was only the heavy, suffocating weight of absolute federal justice. The side door of the courtroom opened with a loud metallic click. 2 armed United States Marshals escorted Richard into the room. A collective quiet gasp echoed from the few reporters sitting in the back rows. The man walking toward the defense table was completely unrecognizable. The charismatic, untouchable billionaire CEO of Kensington Tech was dead. In his place was a hollowed-out, exhausted prisoner. Richard was wearing a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. His hands and feet were shackled with heavy steel chains that clinked rhythmically against the polished floor with every shuffling step he took. His hair was thinning, his skin was pale, and the arrogant spark that had defined his entire existence was permanently extinguished. He slowly lowered himself into the wooden chair beside his court-appointed public defender. The expensive corporate lawyers he used to brag about had completely abandoned him the moment the government froze his assets. He did not look back at the gallery. He simply stared down at his shackled wrists, entirely broken. I shifted my gaze to the wooden benches behind me. Sitting 2 rows back were Patricia and Caroline. The sight of my former mother-in-law and sister-in-law was a stark, brutal testament to the total destruction of their financial empire. Patricia was sobbing quietly into a crumpled paper tissue. She was not wearing her signature diamonds, her imported silk blouses, or her designer shoes. She was wearing a faded, off-the-rack polyester dress that looked like it had been purchased from a discount bin. Her hair, previously maintained by weekly trips to high-end salons, was flat and showing deep roots of gray. The government had completely liquidated her offshore trust accounts and seized the sprawling Connecticut estate as proceeds of crime. She was currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, relying entirely on public assistance. Caroline sat next to her mother, completely motionless. Her face was gaunt, her eyes vacant. She was holding a cheap, cracked vinyl handbag in her lap. DeAndre had filed for divorce the morning after he signed his immunity deal, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the toxic family name she used to wield like a weapon. They had spent years mocking my background, treating me like a charity case because I shopped at discount stores. Now they were drowning in a level of poverty they were entirely unequipped to survive. The bailiff announced the judge and the courtroom rose. The federal judge took his seat at the elevated bench. He was a stern, uncompromising man who had zero patience for corporate criminals. He opened the thick sentencing file resting in front of him. The file contained the fully decrypted master ledger DeAndre had provided, the audio wire from the undercover pilot, the confiscated black market diamonds, and Richard's own frantic confession from the upstate tarmac. The evidence was so overwhelmingly flawless that Richard had been forced to accept a blind plea agreement. There was no trial. There was only the inevitable consequence. Mr. Kensington, the judge, began, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room. You stood before the world as a captain of industry. You enjoyed immense privilege, wealth, and social standing. Yet, driven by an insatiable narcissistic greed, you chose to betray your country. You illegally sold classified military technology to foreign adversaries. You bribed local law enforcement. And when your treason was finally exposed, you kidnapped your own child in a desperate, cowardly attempt to flee justice. Richard kept his head bowed. He did not speak. Your actions demonstrate a complete and utter disregard for the law, the judge continued, his tone turning sharp and condemning. You believed your wealth elevated you above the rules that govern this society. Today, you are going to learn that no amount of money can buy your way out of federal treason. Richard Kensington, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. This sentence is to be served consecutively, without the possibility of parole. Patricia let out a loud, pathetic wail that pierced the quiet courtroom. She slumped forward, burying her face in her hands, mourning the total loss of her son and her status. Caroline did not move a single muscle, her hollow eyes staring blankly ahead. Richard flinched as the gavel slammed down. The loud crack sounded like a gunshot, sealing his fate. The marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing him by the arms to pull him to his feet. As they turned him around to lead him back through the heavy side door, Richard finally lifted his head. His eyes met mine across the room. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply looked at him with the calm, satisfied detachment of an intelligence officer who had successfully neutralized a major threat. He saw the absolute permanence of his defeat in my eyes. He had spent 5 years treating me like I was completely worthless. Now I was the last thing he was going to see as a free man. He lowered his head, the chains dragging heavily across the floor, and disappeared into the dark hallway. He lowered his head, the chains dragging heavily across the floor, and disappeared into the dark hallway. With Richard permanently removed from society, the domino effect rapidly claimed the rest of his enablers. DeAndre had technically survived the federal sweep, but his life as a high-powered corporate executive was completely obliterated. I had honored the immunity agreement we signed in the subterranean parking garage. He did not serve a single day in a federal penitentiary. However, the Securities and Exchange Commission permanently banned him from the financial industry. His licenses were entirely revoked. The brilliant chief financial officer who used to move millions of dollars across the globe before breakfast was reduced to managing the inventory at a mid-level regional logistics warehouse. DeAndre also completely severed his ties to the toxic family that had nearly destroyed him. The morning after the federal raid, he filed for divorce from Caroline. He did not ask for a financial settlement because he knew perfectly well that the federal government had already seized every single penny of the Kensington wealth. He packed his clothes into 2 suitcases, walked out of their rented townhouse, and never spoke to his arrogant wife again. For Patricia and Caroline, the loss of their wealth was a punishment far worse than any prison sentence. The Department of Justice systematically dismantled their entire glamorous existence. The sprawling Connecticut estate was seized and auctioned off to pay restitution. Patricia's offshore trust funds were fully liquidated. The federal agents even confiscated her extensive collection of designer jewelry and luxury handbags, leaving her with absolutely nothing but a few basic items of clothing. With zero income and no marketable skills, the 2 women who had spent their entire lives looking down on the working class were violently shoved into extreme poverty. They were forced to move into a tiny run-down 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying neighborhood on the absolute outskirts of the city. The contrast was staggering. Instead of crystal chandeliers and imported marble floors, they now lived with peeling linoleum, water-stained ceilings, and a rusted radiator that clanked loudly throughout the freezing nights. The sprawling gardens they used to host charity galas in were replaced by a narrow concrete balcony that overlooked a noisy, polluted highway. But the physical poverty was only a fraction of their suffering. The true agony for Patricia and Caroline was their complete social excommunication. They had worshipped high society. Their entire identities were built on country club memberships, exclusive dinner parties, and the arrogant belief that their old money made them elite. Now they were absolute pariahs. I received regular updates from my intelligence network regarding their desperate attempts to cling to their former lives. Caroline had tried to call her wealthy friends, begging for temporary loans or invitations to social events. Every single number was disconnected or aggressively blocked. The elite society of Connecticut had completely closed its ranks, viewing the Kensington name as a toxic radioactive stain. Caroline was eventually forced to apply for entry-level retail jobs, but her resume was completely empty. She had never worked a day in her life, relying entirely on her brother's stolen money. When she was repeatedly rejected by hiring managers, she would lock herself in the tiny apartment bathroom and cry for hours. One afternoon, Caroline attempted to show her face at the upscale organic cafe she used to frequent. She walked in wearing an old designer coat, desperately trying to project her former confidence. A group of women she had once vacationed with in Aspen were sitting at a corner table. When Caroline approached them, the women simply stood up, picked up their expensive coffees, and walked out of the cafe without saying a single word to her. Caroline was left standing alone in the center of the room, completely humiliated, forced to finally realize that her friendships had only ever been shallow transactions. Patricia fared even worse. The arrogant matriarch who used to mock me for buying my shoes at discount outlets was now forced to navigate the public transportation system to reach the local budget grocery store. She had to learn how to aggressively clip coupons just to afford basic necessities. During one of her trips, her debit card was declined at the register for a total of $42. She threw a hysterical tantrum, screaming at the teenage cashier, demanding that he recognize who she was. The cashier simply threatened to call mall security, and Patricia had to leave her groceries behind, walking back to her cramped apartment in the pouring rain. They had spent 5 years treating me like a worthless peasant because I did not possess a trust fund. They had tried to break my spirit with vicious classist insults. Now they were trapped in the exact life they had relentlessly mocked. They had no money, no power, and no family. They were completely invisible. While Patricia and Caroline faded into absolute obscurity, I had one final crucial piece of business to conclude. The criminal trial had sent Richard to prison, and the federal asset forfeiture had wiped out the illegal empire, but the financial war was not entirely over. The Department of Justice had seized 95% of the Kensington wealth, tearing down the offshore shell companies and liquidating the tainted real estate. However, a small fraction of the estate consisted of entirely legitimate pre-marriage investments. More importantly, there was a legally insulated multi-million-dollar educational trust fund that Richard had established for our son the week he was born. Because these specific assets were completely clean and untethered to the treason charges, they remained in a state of legal limbo. By law, they needed a permanent custodian. I sat at the polished mahogany table in the federal civil courthouse on a brisk Tuesday morning. The room was quiet, lacking the intense media circus of the criminal sentencing. I wore a sharp gray blazer, my posture relaxed but commanding. Beside me sat one of the most ruthless financial attorneys in Manhattan, a man I had hired with my own agency salary. Across the aisle sat the opposition. Richard was obviously not present, rotting in his maximum security cell, but he had managed to retain a cheap, desperate civil lawyer. Shockingly, Patricia was also in the courtroom. She sat in the back row wearing her faded polyester dress, clutching her cheap handbag. She had filed a desperate petition with the court, attempting to claim guardianship over her grandson's trust fund. She argued that as the family matriarch, she was entitled to a modest living stipend from the clean assets to maintain the Kensington legacy. It was a pathetic, thinly veiled attempt to steal her own grandson's money to pay for a better apartment. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense woman with decades of experience in financial law, adjusted her glasses and stared down at the petition. She looked at Patricia's lawyer with open disdain. "Counselor," the judge began, her voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. "You are asking this court to hand over fiduciary control of a minor's trust to a woman who is currently under a federal microscope for aiding and abetting a fugitive. Furthermore, your incarcerated client, the boy's father, has petitioned to have a third-party corporate trustee manage the remaining clean assets instead of the child's mother. What exactly is the legal basis for this absurd request?" The sweaty lawyer stood up, clearing his throat nervously. "Your Honor, my clients believe that the child's mother lacks the financial pedigree to manage an estate of this magnitude. They are simply trying to protect the boy's inheritance from mismanagement. I did not even wait for my own attorney to object." I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and addressed the bench directly. "Your Honor," I stated calmly, "the individuals questioning my financial pedigree are currently bankrupt, federally disgraced, and residing in prison. My husband engaged in criminal negligence on a catastrophic scale. He jeopardized his entire family to fund illegal arms deals. He bypassed basic corporate governance, committed massive fraud, and then physically kidnapped the sole beneficiary of this trust in a desperate attempt to flee the country. As for his mother, she provided the untraceable diamonds to fund that exact kidnapping. I picked up a thick binder from my table and held it up. I am a decorated data analyst and intelligence officer for the federal government. I spent 5 years tracking complex international wire transfers and dismantling a global money laundering syndicate from my living room. I am more than capable of managing municipal bonds and an educational trust fund. The judge gave a short, decisive nod. She did not even need to open the binder. She looked directly at Patricia, who shrank back into the wooden bench. "The sheer audacity of this family is staggering," the judge said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. Richard Kensington forfeited any right to dictate his son's financial future the moment he endangered the child's life. His criminal negligence is a matter of federal record. The petition for a third-party trustee is denied. The petition for a grandmother's stipend is entirely dismissed. The judge picked up her pen and signed the heavy stack of legal orders on her desk. "I am awarding full uncontested control of the remaining clean assets and the entirety of the child's trust fund to the mother, Natalie Kensington. You are now the sole trustee and beneficiary administrator. You have complete legal authority to manage, invest, or liquidate these assets as you see fit for the welfare of your son." This court is adjourned. The gavel cracked like a whip. The financial shift was officially complete. Patricia let out a muffled sob, covering her face with her hands, as her final desperate lifeline was severed. She realized in that exact moment that the woman she had relentlessly mocked for being poor now legally controlled the very last remnant of the Kensington fortune. I packed my documents into my briefcase and walked out of the courtroom without giving Patricia a single glance. I stepped out into the bright Manhattan sunlight, feeling the crisp morning air on my face. The money was finally secure, locked away for the only innocent person to ever carry their name. I hailed a cab, eager to get back to my intelligence agency and the beautiful, quiet life I was building with my son. The invisible wife had not just survived the billionaire empire, she had completely conquered it. 6 months after that final gavel fell in Manhattan, my life looked entirely different. I was no longer navigating the suffocating manicured lawns of the Kensington estate, constantly adjusting my behavior to appease a family of sociopaths. Instead, I was walking down the wide historic avenues of Washington District of Columbia. The crisp autumn air carried the distinct energy of absolute power and global consequence. I wore a perfectly tailored charcoal trench coat over a sharp navy blue suit, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pristine pavement. The clothes were impeccable, but they were not bought with stolen corporate funds or a billionaire husband's credit card. They were bought with my own hard-earned salary, a physical manifestation of my entirely reclaimed independence. My right hand was firmly wrapped around the small, warm hand of my son. He was wearing a miniature peacoat, his eyes wide with wonder as he pointed at the massive marble monuments and the bustling city traffic. He was completely safe. The toxic, narcissistic poison of his father's family was permanently removed from his life. He would never be taught to measure a person's worth by the balance of their offshore trust fund, nor would he ever be used as a terrified pawn in a desperate criminal escape plan. He was just a happy, healthy boy, walking with his mother on a bright Tuesday morning, completely unaware of the global espionage network his mother had just dismantled. The journey from the invisible, underestimated housewife to a fully reinstated federal intelligence officer had been brutal, but it had forged me into something utterly unbreakable. Richard was currently locked away in a concrete cell, his daily routine dictated by armed guards and steel doors. Patricia and Caroline were trapped in the crushing poverty they had spent their entire lives mocking, completely erased from the high society they worshipped. I had systematically dismantled their empire of lies from the inside out, turning their own massive arrogance into the ultimate weapon against them. As we approached the massive fortified security perimeter of Langley, a sharp, distinct vibration hummed in the inner pocket of my trench coat. I stopped briefly on the sidewalk, kneeling down to adjust my son's scarf and kissing his forehead. "Wait right here for 1 second, sweetie," I told him, giving his shoulders a reassuring squeeze. I reached into my coat and pulled out my secure government mobile device. The screen illuminated with a highly classified encrypted text notification. It was a direct message from the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I opened the secure channel. The text was brief, but carried the weight of a massive career shift. Operation Kensington is officially archived, the message read. Your flawless execution in dismantling a domestic treason syndicate has completely rewritten our internal protocols for deep cover financial investigations. I am authorizing the immediate creation of a new elite division focused entirely on corporate espionage and illegal military technology transfers. I want you to run it. Meet me in my office on the 7th floor in 10 minutes to discuss your promotion. Director. I read the words twice, feeling a deep, quiet smile spread across my face. I locked the screen and slipped the heavy phone back into my pocket. Richard had spent 5 agonizing years trying to convince me that I was absolutely nothing without his money and his powerful name. His mother and sister had tried to convince me that I was entirely disposable. They were all entirely wrong. I was not a scapegoat meant to take the fall for a billionaire's greed. I was not a victim waiting to be rescued by a broken justice system. I was the architect of my own survival, and I was now holding the reins of a highly specialized federal task force. I stood up and took my son's hand again. We walked confidently toward the heavy reinforced glass doors of the primary intelligence headquarters. The heavily armed security guards stationed at the exterior checkpoint did not ask for my identification. They recognized me instantly. They did not see the pathetic discount shopping wife of a tech CEO. They saw a lethal, brilliant tactical commander who had just handed the federal government the biggest corporate espionage victory of the decade. The lead guard gave me a sharp, respectful nod and pressed the release button, opening the heavy steel security gates to let me pass. I stepped over the threshold into the bustling, high-tech lobby of the agency. The chaotic noise of analysts, field agents, and ringing secure lines washed over me like a welcome home chorus. I dropped my son off at the highly secure agency-run childcare center on the ground floor, giving him one last tight hug before turning toward the private elevator banks. I swiped my top-tier clearance badge, stepping into the stainless steel car as the doors slid shut. As the elevator surged upward toward the director's office, I looked at my reflection in the polished metal doors. The woman staring back at me was fearless, unbroken, and in total control of her destiny. The saga of Natalie and the Kensington family illustrates a timeless and brutal truth. Arrogance is a blinding vulnerability. Throughout the narrative, Richard, Patricia, and Caroline operated under the dangerous delusion that their immense wealth and social status rendered them invincible. They equated a person's worth entirely with their bank account's designer labels and perceived submissiveness. This highly superficial worldview led them to fundamentally underestimate the quiet, observant woman living right under their roof, turning their own narcissism into a fatal flaw. True power does not need to constantly announce itself. While the Kensingtons wasted their energy on loud displays of dominance, cruel classist insults, and reckless corporate greed, Natalie practiced the highly disciplined art of quiet competence. She absorbed their disrespect without reacting emotionally, recognizing that their constant underestimation of her was her greatest tactical advantage. Because Richard genuinely believed his intellect and money made him superior to a seemingly ordinary housewife, he became incredibly careless. He left glaring security vulnerabilities, such as using his mistress's birthday for a master administrative password, that ultimately handed the federal government the keys to dismantle his entire criminal syndicate. This narrative serves as a stark reminder that the loudest, most boastful person in the room is rarely the smartest. Wealth can buy temporary influence and expensive lawyers, but it cannot buy genuine loyalty, resilience, or true strategic foresight. When individuals treat others as disposable or inferior based on arbitrary social metrics, they almost always engineer their own spectacular destruction. Intelligence, discipline, and quiet patience will consistently outmaneuver unearned entitlement and a fragile ego. Examine your own life and relationships today, and commit to actively valuing people for their deep character and unseen strengths rather than their superficial status.